Hello and welcome to this episode of Peace at Last, the podcast that interprets the latest scientific discoveries in psychology, explains techniques and principles from ancient spiritual traditions, and gives you tools to put them into practice. You can change the way you feel and find peace at last. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, psychologist and spiritual traveler. If you like what you hear in this podcast, you may subscribe on the platform of your choice. I also invite you to share your favorite episode with people who might benefit from it. You're listening to episode number 3, and today we're going to talk about how we construct our emotions. And before I get into the subject, I'd like to encourage you to leave questions on the website peaceatlast.us. At the end of each show notes, you'll find a link that says leave a comment or leave a reply. And you can put your questions in there. We only have some basic building blocks and episodes right now, so perhaps you don't have any burning questions. But I do encourage you to leave me a note and tell me about things that you'd like me to talk about. And as we go along, I will create some episodes that would be Q&A episodes. So I'm hoping that I'll hear from you guys. So we're talking about emotions today, and notice that I normally tend to use the word emotions rather than the word feelings. The word feeling often tends to be rather ambiguous. When I used to ask some untrained clients a question like, what are you feeling? They would invariably answer in a sentence that I started with, well, I feel like, and they could say things like, I feel like I'm going to die. I feel like he's going to judge me. I feel like I'm letting them down. I feel like something bad is going to happen, and so on. So those are not what I call feeling words, but judgments. You may want to listen to yourself when you start a sentence with the words I feel like or I feel that. You'll essentially be expressing a belief. Feeling words would be words like sad, happy, anxious, enthusiastic, ashamed, confident, resentful, etc. And our vocabulary is somewhat impoverished when it comes to speaking about our emotions. For example, there isn't a feeling word to express the emotion we experience when someone just rejected us. We simply say we felt rejected. But rejected is making an interpretation of somebody else's behavior. Perhaps when Molly didn't turn around when I called her, she was intentionally giving me the cold shoulder. Or perhaps she was engrossed in her own thoughts and she simply didn't hear me. Either way, if I interpret her behavior as a rejection, then I will have a set of emotions that I may have experienced countless times before. So I call that set of emotions feeling rejected. So note that when I believe that somebody rejected me, I may feel sad, perhaps because I missed their company or their friendship. I may feel lonely because I imagine that no one else will love me. I may feel ashamed because I made myself vulnerable and I wasn't accepted. I also may feel resentful because somehow I felt entitled to some consideration on her part. Whichever of those I feel will greatly depend on my own life experiences and my state of mind. So, when someone tells you that they feel quote-unquote rejected, you might want to inquire further into what that means for them. And I want to talk about the classical view of emotions. You know, you may have seen in elementary school classrooms those little emojis on the wall with, smiley face, a frowny face, sad face, and so on. These come from the classical view of emotion. That's a concept that we have evolved specific emotion circuits like deep within our brain, and that they produce and they encode a set of very basic emotions, and that those emotions have the same fingerprint in any human, maybe even any other mammals. So when specific stimuli occur in the world, these circuits will get triggered and produce the appropriate change in our body physiology, our neurochemistry, our perceived sensations, and finally in our behavior. So, and that theory also claims that the basic set of emotions is so universal that any culture in the world can recognize which emotion someone expresses just by looking at their face. So by the way, Paul Ekman and the researchers working with him conveniently narrowed those basic emotions down to 7. And those emotions are anger, disgust, fear, surprise, happiness, sadness, and contempt. And a number of high-tech companies are even trying to capitalize on this supposed fact that emotions can be read on someone's face. They're spending millions of dollars trying to recognize this. If you look at the show notes, you'll see the picture of a man in distress. He's looking like he's about to cry. This man is soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo. The picture was taken in 2016 at the European Championship final, where Ronaldo was playing for Portugal's national soccer team. France had just scored a decisive goal against his team. If you're near your computer, or if you can look at the show notes, I encourage you to go look at this picture. But even if you don't see it, the fact is that in that picture, the goal that Ronaldo had just witnessed was Portugal's first goal against France. And the emotion displayed on his face is one of elation. His watery eyes want to cry not tears of sadness, but tears of joy. And so if you had seen the picture before you heard these words, you would have been primed to see a man who's upset. And you probably would have agreed with me. But it's only in the context that you can tell for sure what the expression on his face meant. So that's to point out the importance of context when you're looking at the emotions on somebody's face. There's another researcher, Jack Panksepp, who found a different set of basic emotions. Coincidentally, there are also 7 in his theory. There's got to be some magical thing about the number 7, like the 7 habits of highly effective people, the 7 spiritual laws of success, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 continents, the 7 dwarfs. So the trouble is that Panksepp called his primal emotions seeking, rage, fear, lust, care, panic, and play. Rather different from the Ekman study. Now, I wonder if that could have anything to do with the fact that he derived his theory of emotions from animals, in particular from rats. Now, I don't want to sound contemptuous toward rats, but can rats even feel contempt? And how would we even know what rats feel? Besides, he was placing electrodes in their brain and doing this in order to stimulate particular brain regions. Even if you position them with extreme accuracy, that does not produce consistent results. You don't always get the same behavior, and people who have participated in that research will confirm that. So the classic theory of emotions might need some reworking, and that's what I would like to present here. I have been very interested in the research that was done by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She's a professor at Northeastern University. And she points out that electrically stimulating a particular region of a rat's brain, observing its behavior, and concluding that what you're observing is like the emotion of fear, this is equivalent to actually defining fear as the behavior that is being observed. It's like a circular definition. For example, if I define boredom as the repeated tapping of fingertips on a tabletop, like this, and if I see you tapping your fingers on the table, I'll conclude that you are bored. And I'll be right, because that is my definition of boredom. It might not be what you're experiencing at all, but again, if you're a rat, I'll never be able to ask you. Now, no one will deny that our brain produces emotions. So the question is, if they're not produced by dedicated neuronal circuits, how then are they created? Some of you may have heard that our emotions reside in a rather primitive part of our brain, like the reptilian brain, for the more survival-related emotions, fear, anger, libido. And also in the mammalian brain for the more social-related emotions like bonding, love, playfulness. You may even have heard that there's a small part of our brain called the amygdala that's a place of where our fear circuits reside. The amygdala is kind of an interesting target to pick because it's a rather separate part of the brain and looks like a little almond. That's why it was called amygdala. And it was tempting to place some very specific function there. Well, reality is a lot more complex than that, and Lisa Barrett's research seems to indicate that no brain on Earth actually has dedicated emotion circuits. Instead, the brain behaves like other biological systems by using different mechanisms to generate the same outcome. In fact, if you lose one region of your brain, the brain tends to adapt and reroute the function around that so that it can still operate. So for the brain, the outcome of the experience is an emotion, but that can be produced by different regions. So I'd like to kind of come to a definition of the word emotion because we haven't really defined it. And it's not as straightforward as we might think at first. In some cultures, outside of the mainstream Western culture, what we would refer to as emotion is actually equated with behavior. And that's without presuming whether someone has any internal experience. Even in our culture, the early behaviorists like B.F. Skinner were actually leaning in that direction. Only what was observable was considered valid. But for our purpose here, what we consider an emotion starts with an internal sensation, and that's using a sense called interoception. Interoception is our sense of the internal state of our body. So, for example, I know that in my case, when I perceive what I would label as anxiety, I feel sort of a constriction in the center of my chest. That's an example of interoception. But interoception doesn't have to be uniquely related to emotions. If I have a heartburn, I will also feel a strong feeling in the center of my chest, albeit somewhat different. That too is an example of interoception. So what's the difference between the first case, anxiety, and the second, heartburn? Well, the main difference, and I hope that you'll stay with me this is how I interpret the sensation, and it's based on my context. In other words, do I give that sensation, that interoception, an emotional meaning? So to be more precise here, I'd like to introduce a new notion, and this is the concept of affect, A-F-F-E-C-T. This word has the same root as affection or affectionate. Affect is your basic sense of feeling, and it has two main components. One is valence and the other one is arousal. The valence dimension is a dimension that ranges from unpleasant to pleasant. And the arousal dimension goes from agitated to calm, or calm to agitated. So in that sense, those two dimensions are rather simple. A pleasant valence will make me want more of what I have, and an unpleasant valence will make me want to move away from it. So if I'm happy, I'm going to experience pleasant affect, and I will try to make the situation persist. On the other hand, if I'm miserable, I'm going to try to change the situation. Jim Russell of the University of British Columbia selected a set of 28 feeling words, such as excited, angry, miserable, or sleepy. And if you go to the show notes, you'll see a circular diagram that he called the circumplex model of affect. It's a little bit of a mouthful. But in that diagram, the feeling words are arranged around the circle, and they're positioned roughly according to their level of arousal and their level of valence. So, afraid, for example, will have high arousal and a negative valence, while serene will have a low arousal but a positive valence. James Russell, when he did his study, found that there was a variation on the valence and arousal for different feeling words. What I've put in my diagram, just to make it prettier, and because it doesn't really matter that much, I've put them around a circle. And of course, our emotions are not limited to 28 feeling words. This is just to try to get a little bit of a range on the graph of affect. So when we talk about a positive emotion, it will be associated with a pleasant affect, while a negative emotion will be associated with an unpleasant affect. And I must admit, though, that I don't really like using the terms positive or negative when it comes to emotions. And that's because emotions are there for a purpose. If I feel fear and that gets me to run away from danger, can I really say that fear is a negative emotion? It saved my life. What about if I feel sad to have lost a friend? Am I not signaling that way that the friendship meant a lot to me? Or if I feel guilty about having hurt someone, doesn't it mean that I'm taking responsibility for my actions? So in future episodes, I sometimes refer to emotions as negative or positive. If I do this, keep in mind that it's just a shorthand for talking about mind states where I either want to change something or where I want more of the same. So we've talked about the two notions of interoception and affect. And these functions are hardwired in us. They're built into our brain. Presumably, they're built into the brains of other animals too. But our emotions are not hardwired. They're constructed. And they're based on a large number of experiences that we've had along our lives. So this is how I will define these words for the rest of the episode in this podcast. And I may refer back to this episode in the future if I think that there may be any ambiguity. So keep in mind that not everyone uses the same definitions for emotion or affect. Interoception is pretty standard. Some scientists use the word affect when they really mean emotion, or vice versa. Others use the word emotion interchangeably with the more nebulous word feeling. In psychotherapy, the word affect is pretty much used in the same sense as I have defined it here. So I want you to remember, if you're going to compare someone else's presentation to what I'm talking about in this episode, make sure that the definitions coincide. So according to Lisa Feldman Barrett, the brain's job is to manage our energy budget. This is the circulation of glucose and oxygen and so on in our body physiology. Now, we don't really think about this in our day-to-day world. We don't really try to manage our body budget because we have created a pretty comfortable environment. We can set the air temperature to the degree we like. We can access food and water whenever we like. We can take a shower at just the right temperature. And certainly, last time I checked, we're not busy trying to escape from a predator chasing us on a regular basis. But in more ancient times, having just a bit more energy to survive the winter when someone else didn't, or having a little bit more speed than your neighbor to flee from a saber-toothed tiger, that allow you to pass on your genes and not your neighbor's genes. So that's how our brain has evolved, and that's why it's working in the way it's working. So in order to manage the budget, the brain makes predictions. And we're not talking about long-term predictions here, but predictions on the order of milliseconds. Common wisdom says that we perceive what's happening around us, and then we react with the appropriate emotion and behavior. But in fact, it's mostly the other way around. We predict what's going to happen next. And this prediction is a form of belief. We've talked about beliefs before. And our brain manages our physiology according to that prediction. So take, for example, a time when you walk into an ice cream parlor. Your brain is already predicting the taste of your favorite ice cream on your tongue. For me, it's coffee ice cream. And your salivary glands are producing saliva. The stomach is beginning to secrete digestive juices, and your whole body is getting in gear to best digest the treat, and that's surely about to come. This is more efficient than waiting for the food to enter the body before starting the digestive process. You've probably heard of Ivan Pavlov's study. He had a dog salivate when hearing a bell. So the dog's nervous system was conditioned to predict the arrival of the food. And when the bell was rung several times in a row without the food appearing, the dog's nervous system began to correct its prediction error and stop salivating. So this cessation is called extinction in behaviorism. So when the dog's nervous system was doing that, it was managing the body's budget. It was not wasting energy on non-existent food. So right now, in this moment, your very brain, dear listener, is making constant predictions. As you're listening to this episode, your brain is making guesses about what will be the next word coming out of my nose. Did you feel the double take? The subtle hesitation when your brain, who was predicting that it was going to hear the word mouth, suddenly heard the word nose. In that instant, it just reconfigured itself in order to correct its prediction error. An interesting case of predictions going awry is this 2011 study of parole boards in Israel. The researcher Shai Danziger and his colleagues found that the judges' percentage of favorable rulings, that is to say, when they granted parole to the prisoners, were dropping gradually from about 65% at the start of the day to nearly zero right before the lunch break. And then the rulings return to their initial percentage when the judges return from lunch. A possible interpretation here is that the judges mistook their unpleasant affect, remember what the affect is, they mistook their affect for a bad feeling about the prisoner who's coming out for parole. In the same vein, in her book, How Emotions Are Made, Lisa Feldman Barrett gives the following advice. When you apply for a job or college or medical school, make sure you interview on a sunny day because interviewers tend to rate applicants more negatively when it's rainy. So put that in your pocket. The internal feelings that make up affect have been with us from infancy. Calmness, agitation, comfort, and discomfort. They're created by a newborn's body and neurophysiology. In fact, if you check in with yourself right now, you will certainly perceive some internal sensation that registers somewhere on the affect circle. So if you like this podcast, my hope is that you fall somewhere on the pleasant side of the valence, and yet that you experience at least a little bit of arousal that will encourage you to practice some of the principles I'm discussing here. But there's one more step before you can call this an emotion. You may remember a number of lectures you've heard in the past. You may evoke the fascination that came over you when you discovered a new concept and connect this to prior experiences. And so as a result, you may call what you feel now interest. That would be your emotion. You've connected it to a multiplicity of past experiences, and suddenly the affect that you were experiencing has acquired a richness of detail by becoming an emotion. And so it's the granularity of that detail, that is, how finely you can distinguish one emotion from another, that's a predictor of greater happiness and success in life. That's what's called emotional intelligence. This is a concept that was coined by Daniel Goleman. So if you have a specific concept or a feeling word for more specific situations, that's emotional intelligence. For example, if my only emotion concepts are happy, sad, and angry, I'm not going to have a very good discernment. There was a 1993 article in the New York Times that described some research done by Roy Baumeister of Case Western Reserve University, and that showed that we tend to hear the stories in literature of the rejected lover, the unrequited love. Cyrano de Bergerac is an example of that. But in that story, the other side, the rejecter, often can feel just as bad. And yet, the rejector's story is seldom told. What that means is that people who have been rejected can draw on many cultural references and they can make sense of their pain. The rejecter, on the other hand, not so much. Baumeister suggests that it makes it more difficult for the rejecter to come to terms with the confusing feelings they're experiencing. And I use the term feeling here intentionally because they may not be able to label them accurately as emotions. And that's where I would like to introduce a practical tool. If you have a finer-grained conceptual system for your emotions, you can make more precise predictions. You can construct your experiences differently. And ultimately, you can reduce your emotional suffering. So for a practice, I have provided in the show notes a handout with a bunch of feeling words. On one side, you'll find words that correspond to a positive valence, pleasant affect. On the other side of the handout, you'll find words that correspond to a negative valence. And you may notice that the negative side has a list that's quite a bit longer than the positive side. That's a sign that our culture has a finer resolution for uncomfortable emotions than it does for pleasant ones. Perhaps we need to expand our list beyond the too common word happy and add some richness to our joyful experiences. And that imbalance may not only be cultural, but could be related to the fact that our brain has a negative bias, or as Rick Hansen likes to say, it's like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. But we'll talk about this in the future episode. For today, print out that list and expand your emotional vocabulary. So when somebody asks you how you are doing, instead of the mundane reply, fine, try on the following feeling words. For size, I'm feeling giddy today. I'm quite cheerful, lad. Feeling mellow. And I didn't include in that list the more archaic words like mirth, levity, or jocundity. But feel free to give them a new life, and in the process, increase your emotional intelligence. So this concludes this episode of Peace at Last. For more information, go to peaceatlast.us, where you'll find the show notes for this episode and future episodes. If you have comments or questions, please leave them on the website, or you can email me directly at fabrice@life.net. I may be selecting your question as a topic for a future episode. If you just discovered this podcast, I invite you to subscribe on iTunes or on the platform of your choice. If you like it and you want to support it, please share this episode with at least one person who you think might benefit from it. You can also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am Dr. Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join me next time for another episode of Peace at Last.